Hi, did we get it working?
Hey, there you are.
I am so sorry. First time
Hey.
doing Instagram Live.
Well, glad to have you here. We worked today. There's always something.
Yep, glad we finally made it. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
your patience.
Well, and thank you. I mean, I've been excited to talk about your book. So my name's Lindsay. I'm a bookseller at Lighthouse Books. My pronouns are she, her. Ryan, do you wanna introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about your book, Bleeding Hearts?
Hi, my name's Herman.
Oh,
Um,
sorry,
no,
Ree.
no problem. Everyone gets it wrong, so I don't mind. My pronouns are he or they. And Bleeding Hearts is the second book in a series I'm writing of queer supernatural romance novels, sort of an urban fantasy flavored set of books set in the late 1990s, early 2000s, with vampires and witches and angels and werewolves and queer people falling in love. And here's a copy.
It's such a cute cover.
Yeah, I
And
love covers.
I love the you have the cat as entropy.
Yes,
Um, who, yes,
based.
plays a small but pivotal role in the story. Um, I mean, yeah, talking like you mentioned the time period that it's set, and it seems it's an unusual like for me it's quite unusual. It feels very significant that it's set against the background of the Bush Gore like election in
Yes.
in 2000, and that's a very specific moment. And what was it that the like what did that mean to you? What was it that made you decide to go there?
Well, one reason that's part of the background of the book is that what it was sort of a it was a pivotal moment in the LGBTQ rights struggle in the U.S. In the throughout the 1990s, support for queer rights had really increased just astonishingly quickly in the US. But at the same time, there was a huge pushback against it and reaction to it. And it kind of came to a head in the 2000 election, which was really the first time that uh, queer people had been explicitly used as a political football in the US. Because the Republican Party, the right wing, was saying, vote for us, or oh no, gays will get married, the horror. And it became a huge issue. Um, and uh, Unfortunately, there is no real left wing party in the US. There's a center left party and right wing party. So the Democrats, their side of it was, well, maybe civil unions someday, perhaps. But that was still, better than the other side, which was against everything having to do with any rights for LGBTQ people. And then when the election happened, it was frozen because it problems with the election. I think a lot of people remember the hanging chads, the issues in Florida, meant that no one knew who won for months and months and months. And eventually, the Republicans stole it, frankly, with the aid of their appointees on the Supreme Court. And so it seemed like a real blow against civil rights at that time. But one of the interesting things that happened is it didn't stop what was going on. And 4 years later, when it was still the Bush administration, same-sex marriage became legal in Massachusetts, the first state in the US that legalized it. And that sort of started an avalanche, which just kept going and going in spite of states, during this 2000 election, a little before it, trying to pass their own laws that said, we are making it illegal to pass any laws that say same-sex marriage is allowed. It just kept going forward until eventually it became completely legal in the U.S.
Mm.
And one thing I'm seeing now, incidentally, is that the exact same arguments that were made against same-sex marriage in 2000 are now being trotted out again against trans rights. Like the exact same word for word, just barely tweaked. You know, do you feel safe being in the bathroom with these people? And they're coming to recruit your children. All these ridiculous scare stories are being replayed. And so
Yeah,
I,
was it like 2000s ish, the whole like, oh, what's next, like dogs getting married, like that kind of
yeah,
stuff was pointed out.
exactly.
Yeah.
Uh, and so while it's depressing that the right wing has no new arguments to use, is using the same arguments at the same time, wow, they really have no new arguments, do they? So
They got one joke. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting that you have these characters who are, you know, they're monsters, but they're um, you know, they're living on the outskirts of society and kind of, although they are powerful like vampires in this world, um, have an extreme power, they're also extremely vulnerable, and just as vulnerable to the kind of systemic power that you're talking about. It just feels like it's unfolding around them. They have to just kind of hope for the best in this weird liminal like time that you set it in. Um, and sorry, go ahead.
No, no, go on.
So I was struck by like your portrayal of Angela, who is the vampire in your story, is um, I mean, lesbian goth vampire. Like, you know, you're writing for me. Like that's just that's my shit right there. Love it. Um, and like you talk about how the like goth clubs are her terrain as well.
Mhm.
Like is one of the lines that I really liked, and that kind of struck me as like, especially in the present moment, with everything kind of with still sort of slowly coming out of lockdown, where you're not really able to have the same sense of community anymore. And because I saw that you mentioned that the kind of afterword of your book that you'd had like um, really positive experiences in goth clubs yourself. Like,
Right.
well, what does that kind of space like mean to you as a queer person?
It meant a lot. So I so I first went to a goth club. Some friends dragged me there in the wake after a very bad breakup I had. Um, and at first I was very reluctant to go because I knew nothing about it. It was like a nightclub. But you know, I'm sort of an introverted person, and I was like, you know, I thought of nightclubs as, you know, places where, you know, college kids go to hit on each other. And then I stepped into a goth club for the first time and was sort of like, oh, my people. Um, and in terms of, you know, a queer space, it's really one of the most open and accepting places I had ever encountered, especially at the time I was going, um, when, you know, as I said, you know, this was back in the 90s when not too far, you know, LGBTQ rights were still sort of struggling to be heard, and it was not too far removed from the time when they were just being completely demonized, and that was still a very strong component of society, you know, still is, but even more so then. Um, and there was just this space where no one cared. No one cared who you were dancing with. No one cared who you were dating. No one cared what you were wearing. It was, and that was, well, as long as you were black.
Of
but
course.
no one cared what you were wearing in terms of, yes, you could go in a skirt, you could go in a dress, you could go in trousers, um, and it was simply not only accepted but normalized, and that was so freeing. And that on top of the fact that I loved the music and loved the aesthetic and just the whole idea of it, I really felt like it was, finding a place to exist almost.
Mm.
And it probably doesn't hurt that I met my spouse of now 20 years through the goth scene. And
Was that in Edinburgh, did you say?
no, that was actually in Boston, where the book is set. There was a club called Man Ray, which is sadly now defunct, like many goth clubs of that era. It was just a lovely space. There was just two dance spaces, and a place to talk, and a bar. Just many, many fond memories of going there and to other places.
Yeah,
Um,
I miss
in the
that so much.
Yes, I do too.
It's, yeah, the sense of community um, is is really powerful for such a, what can be a very small scene, and very open. Um, and it was nice to see that reflected. I mean, you definitely see like a lot of people taking on the aspects of like vampires and witches in the goth community, obviously. And I was curious as like, I don't know, how do you feel about vampirism as a kind of queer trope almost?
Well, I'm very interested in that. That's actually one of the things that went into the writing of these books, sort of the examination of that. Um, Monsters, when people write monsters, when people invent monsters, they're about what people fear. And if you look at sort of the modern version of the European vampire myth, the origins of the story that sort of still persists today, it dates from the Victorian times, and it was about sex. It was about what was perceived as transgressive sex. And if you read books like Dracula, it is really dripping with it. The characters are talking about, the lips against the soft skin of my throat, the sensitive skin and the hard dent of two sharp fangs. It's really barely disguised. And Dracula, it's very easy to read it as a horror story about, oh no, a sexy immigrant coming here to seduce women.
Mm.
Um, and at the same time, you had, again, in this early set of vampire stories that really informs the modern perception of it, Carmilla, which is the first sort of lesbian vampire story, the seductive, mysterious lesbian who takes the life force of young women.
What an
And so,
icon.
yeah, and so the sexy vampire and the queer vampire are embedded into the origins of the modern legend. And what was really interesting to me is that the story around them changed. That basically from, oh no, lesbian vampires, as queer acceptance grew and grew, suddenly you saw kind of a transformative switch. And queer vampires sort of persisted in the stories but became the heroes and started becoming protagonists. And um, and so it kept the same sort of mythic resonance, but the social perception of it changed. It flipped 180 degrees from villain to hero, and that was very interesting to me and something I really wanted to play with in writing these books.
Well, it's interesting that you mention, yeah, like the power of characters as mythos, because I mean, your story goes right back to like creation myths almost, right? Like the story of going
Yes.
the underworld. What was it that made you want to kind of to play with those kind of myths as
So,
well, the stories.
well, um, something I'm interested in as a fantasy writer. Um, there's a lot of ways to write fantasy, and I love them all. There are fantasy novels written where sort of the rules of magic are like a role-playing game where they're very set. You do this and this happens. It's sort of a different kind of science. It's very structured, and I love those. But I'm also interested in sort of the idea of magic as touching the numinous, almost as touching something almost incomprehensible. And so when I wrote this story about um, with witchcraft in it and spells, I wanted to include sort of something that touches back to sort of the deep myths and archetypes and goes back to, very old stories like the trip to the underworld, um, the the person trapped there, the rescue, um, the trading places, things that go back to some of the very earliest myths that are recorded. I mean, Gilgamesh is about, the quest for immortality and the trip to the underworld, and Persephone and Hecate, which is the one I used. And I really wanted um, to touch on that. To
Yeah.
and
Um,
Sorry, go
you
on.
like so yeah, it's an interesting kind of split that's happening. I mean, I suppose it's always been a split going right back into the history of fantasy writing, but it seems all the more kind of explicit now. This sort of hard magic system stories, as opposed to something that's that's a little more mysterious. And um, I mean, I've always enjoyed like Michael Moorcock for his like
Oh,
kind of
absolutely.
strangeness of magic. Um, and it kind of reminded me of that. This is just like the kind of the journey, which is almost like a road trip through hell.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, the and but and I love that you're queering that as well. That's love to see that. Um, I mean I mean and the use of magic, you're straight up referencing like sigil magic and magic um, as like metaphor made real.
Yes.
And I was curious because when I saw you talking about that in the book, it reminded me of when I heard Grant Morrison talking about their work. I think it was on, I want to say like The Invisibles, where they had put they put sigils into their work and found and kind of manifested characters into their lives and manifested events into their lives. And I was curious if you had done that or were ever tempted to use your work as practice.
Not quite as intentionally as that. Um, but sort of one of the definitions of magic that comes up in the book is that a spell is a story you tell the universe and hope that the universe answers back. Um, and so in a way, I do think that, all fiction has, not just fantasy, but all fiction, all storytelling has something of that element to it. Stories are ways we interpret the world, they're ways we define the world, they're ways we try to change the world in a way. And so simply sending out a story um, into the cosmos, I think in a way is a kind of spell, is a kind of magic, however directly or indirectly you want to call that. And in terms of it manifesting back in your own life, I think every writer has experienced those resonances, has seen, has perceived the things they write, um, in reality, has seen a response, and whether that's simply because the story changes your perception or something else, I don't know, but even changing your perception is, again, it's a kind of magic. I mean, the thing that really draws me to fantasy, I think, more than anything else, fantasy writing, is its ability to make metaphor real. To take something, like an idea like a vampire or a spell or magic, and in the context of the pages, turn it into reality. Um, and of course, that's all the same way that monsters are fears. These things are emotions. These things are interactions. Sharp words become fangs. Wishes become spells, and that really draws me. That directness of turning thought into form, emotion into action, um, is something I love about the fantasy genre.
I love that. I love that answer. Yes, that's good. Um, so I mean, we're in Pride Month just now,
And happy Pride Month.
and Happy Pride, yes.
Thank you.
And um, you know, you always tend to see a lot of like lists going around this time of year of I think it's interesting because I don't know. I'm curious what you think about this because I feel like um, when you see lists going around of like queer movies, a lot of it will be like kind of a retroactive reading of like or like a subtextual reading um, of like kind of queering movies.
Sure.
And I was curious, like, what do you think? Do you think that like we're kind of having to do that still in lists of like literature, or do you think that like in well, particularly in terms of like fantasy like literature, like how do you feel like the sort of overtness of depictions of queerness has evolved in the last few years?
I think it's become a lot less subtextual than it used to, honestly. I actually think there's been kind of a, a burgeoning, an explosion of textual depictions of queer characters in fantasy and science fiction. And it's really been striking to me because I remember, in the 90s, um, it being very, very difficult to find any queer characters in science fiction and fantasy. There were a few, and they were sort of precious. I can think of like Ellen Kushner's Swords Point, or Nicola Griffith's Slow River, and a few others. Um, but it was incredibly hard to find. And then sort of in the 2000s, um, you could find them, but they weren't in the mainstream. There were indie presses, and there was a ton of fan fiction. But again, the fan fiction was often, you know, making the subtext text, or adding in text. I mean, some of the very earliest fan fiction was, Kirk Spock slash fiction,
Right.
and um, and similar things to that, Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy, all these
Was
things.
was fan fiction like a was that something that you were interested in terms of like community and writing or just enjoying?
Um, I've written some fan fiction. I think a lot of authors writing today have, especially in the, science fiction and fantasy community, especially in the science fiction and fantasy queer community. Um, I I I wasn't as deep into it as some, but there was definitely, stuff I was reading from way early on that, like, I love these characters, and um, I want to see more with them, and I want the subtext to become text,
Right.
and fan fiction was a way to get that. So yeah, I did write a little, I did read some, and I think a lot of I don't think that's an uncommon story now, because
Oh, no problem.
it contained something we were looking for. Um, and I think that's part of the reason for the change that has occurred. Because I put it to around about 2014. That's when I first started really noticing that suddenly queer characters were around in mainstream science fiction and fantasy, in mainstream publishers. Just suddenly, where before there'd been a couple authors, um, yeah, in the 2000s, who got books published in the Laurie J. Marks, Catherine Valente, Jacqueline Carey, all had some queer characters, but again, very rare. When you found one, you were like, oh wow, I found one. And then suddenly in 2014, it's like there's a bunch of them all being published. And then, you look at lists now, and there's like, 15 being published in a single month, a lot of them by mainstream publishers.
Mm.
And I feel like the mainstream has finally caught up to what was going on with all those people who were looking for those stories, who were trying to find them. And I do think some are lagging behind a little. I really would like to see more trans narratives. And again, there are more than there used to be. April Daniels' Nemesis series
Yeah.
springs to mind, and there are other authors writing them, like Full Fathom 5 by Max Gladstone. Again, you can find them,
Yeah.
but
Full Hard. Yeah. It's a good one.
I'd, I'd like, I'd like them to, I'd like to see that get to the point where they're as easy to find as, as cis same-sex relationships are in science fiction and fantasy right now. I'd love to see it get to that point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that's really interesting that it happens around that kind of specific time. Um, were you aware at the time of, like, I don't know, like, what do you think it was that happened around that time? Was it just like more sort of people getting involved, or was it like a shift within publishers?
I think it was both. Um, I I'm not sure, honestly, exactly what happened. I noticed it and remember it vividly because I was the person who was always seeking out, fantasy and science fiction is my jam, and I was always a person seeking out the queer narratives, looking, oh, here's one, I found it. And then suddenly it was like, I don't have to search so hard anymore. They're just there. And my suspicion is that, it is the authors who grew up reading and writing fan fiction and said, no, we want this to be text. And I think it is the publishers, catching up to the changes that were already happening and realizing that there was a market for it as well. And I mean, if you go back to what we started talking about sort of the change, the acceptance that started growing and growing in the 1990s, um, you know, as I said, I don't think it's complete. I think there's been backslide. I think there's always a long way to go with civil rights, but I really think that um, it has filtered in to the culture in a way that it hadn't 20, 30 years ago, that it's made its way there.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely something that I've noticed as well, as yes, as the generally the person at Lighthouse who's most into queer sci-fi fantasy. It's been great to see all the new stuff coming out. Um, I think that'll do us for tonight, and thank you so much, Ree, for joining us.
Thank
Ree's fantastic novel, Bleeding Hearts, is out today. You can find it on our website, Lighthouse Books. at lighthousebookshop.com at $9.99. And Ree, where can we find you on the internet, on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter at re underscore Herman, RY underscore Herman. I've also got a WordPress blog at rehermanwrites.wordpress.com. And yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We will be uploading this video to our website, so you can watch it back, and have a lovely evening. Thanks, Ree.
You too. Thank you so much. And thank Lighthouse Books, which is a wonderful bookstore that everyone everywhere should go to. Absolutely.
Pleasure. Bye.
Bye.